Shalom Mishpachah. Welcome to another GoyaGroup.com video. We make these videos to provide source information to those seeking truth, so that all believers and followers of Yahweh Elohim may come to one accord based in truth. Yahweh Elohim is the designation of the mighty one or deity of Yashar'al or ancient Israel, of which the Bible is derived. As always, we have restored the name of the Father Yahweh from the inserted title Lord and the designation of power to all or Elohim from the inserted title God. Yahweh is a tetragrammaton, which is four Abrit or Hebrew letters of Yud, He, Uau, He, that appears almost 7,000 times in the Torah Tanakh, or the Hebrew version of the Old Testament. This is a three-part video series that will be on the validity of the New Testament. Is the New Testament presented by the Catholic Church true? Is it useful? Is it even scripture? The short answer is no. Part 2 of the series. Is the New Testament true? The historical truth about Paul of Tarsus and his relationship to the Herodian dynasty. There is so much information, and this is such a heated topic among believers, that we couldn't do it justice in an hour alone. So this video will be broken up into 3 sections, A, B, and C. Part 2A will focus on the Idumi or the Edomites entering into the priesthood of Yashar'al or Israel. The next section, Part 2B, will be about identifying the sect or group that HaMashiach belonged to, along with his family members. The last section, Part 2C, will conclude the video with the historical truth of Paul's travels to Yerushalayim or Jerusalem. We will give the viewer all primary and secondary sources. These are the sources from a first-hand account of events, and secondary sources are scholarly sources commenting on the topic of the primary sources or first-hand accounts. Basically, primary sources saw what happened, and secondary sources only heard about what happened or are discussing it directly. This is how we will present the source information. Anything you see inside of parentheses are words that have simply been restored to their original translations. An example of this is Kuhan or Kohen in Abrit or Hebrew, which is the word priest in English. It will be displayed as Kuhan with priest inside parentheses following. Anything you see inside of brackets are words that have been restored and given a more accurate meaning, or is extra information for context. An example of this is the phrase Ruach HaKadosh, which would normally be translated from Abrit into the English term Holy Spirit or Ghost. But since that is not a true reflection of the term, the phrase the set-apart spirit in brackets will follow the Hebrew word. Also, anytime information from a text is given without context, that information will be supplied in the same way, so that a phrase that reads, the king died suddenly, will now read, the king, inside of brackets, the name of the king, died suddenly. Anything you see inside recurved parentheses are original translator notations and have nothing to do with us. An example of this is the text states that they all followed him inside of recurved parentheses because they chose to see. This would be the original text with the parentheses intact. So please, feel free to pause the video at any time and write down any sources so you can verify the information presented here for yourselves. We're going to use a simple metaphor to help us explain the historical identification in sections A, B, and C of this video. Think of history at this time period as a geological strata or the layers of Earth. This is the whole time period right here. All right. There are 4 strata or layers to it. And just like in geology, the oldest layers are at the bottom and the newer layers are at the top. Consider the oldest layer at the bottom as solid granite that is unbreakable. That's all the way down here. That layer is rock solid. That is your foundation layer. The next layer above it, this would be concrete. This is kind of like the granite, but it's not as strong. You see, it's porous. It has little holes all in it. Then the layer right above that would be nothing but gravel. This is just like gravel would shift under your feet. This right here would shift under your feet too. This history isn't as solid. This sand has small parts of everything that came before it, but it isn't consistent enough to build anything on top of. The first layer of granite is, as we said, the foundation layer. And this is from the time period from about 6 BCE to 100 CE, which is basically the whole of the first century or the Common Era. This layer has the accounts from the 12 Shilikim, which is a Greek or Hebrew for emissaries, which is what we would describe as the people who we call apostles today. So all of Kepha, Yaakov, Tuma, Mattityahu, all the famous names, they're going to be found in this layer. This layer will also include the 70 Talmudim, which is a Greek or Hebrew for taught ones, or what you would call disciples today. And this is going to include people like Barnabas or Barnabas. And these people and the 12 are people who actually spoke directly and learned from HaMashiach, or the primary character of the New Testament, or what we will call the NT. This is who the Roman Church presents as the Messiah and his followers. There are no degrees of separation between these people and the message that the Messiah figure of the NT delivers. Their doctrines are in one accord with this Messiah figure and solid. This layer will also include anyone who is directly involved with all the events surrounding the Messiah figure depicted in the NT. The next layer of concrete in the strata is from the period from about 70 CE to about 150 CE, or the late 1st century into the middle of the 2nd century of the Common Era. This group or layer is made up of people commonly referred to by scholars as the Apostolic Fathers. These are people who did not know the primary character of the NT called the Messiah, nor were they involved in anything depicted involving the Messiah of the NT, but they knew the 12 and the 70 that did know him. So they knew, basically they didn't know the man, but they knew the men who knew the man. This group is one degree of separation from the message and doctrines of the Messiah figure, and although this information is not as accurate as the first strata because of some holes, you know what I'm saying, some of those porous things in the concrete, they will be pretty close though. The next layer of the strata is just gravel from the period from about 140 CE to about 240 CE, or the middle of the 2nd century to the early 3rd century of the Common Era. This group or layer is made up of people who are commonly referred to by scholars as the early church fathers. These people lived right before the Orthodox Catholic Church was formed, and much of their theology was heavily borrowed by the Orthodox Catholic Church later. These individuals did not know the Messiah figure of the New Testament, nor anyone who knew him. However, they knew of the Apostolic Fathers and are then 2 degrees removed from the Messiah figure. This layer is where people started to get really creative, and their information will definitely be distorted from the first layer. And as you grab on the pieces, things are going to shift a little bit, but it will only be in direct conflict with the information some of the time, with a lot of solid information still left in little chunks. The last layer for the purpose of this study is nothing but sand, and it dates from the period of about 220 CE to 350 CE, or in the early 3rd century to the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era. This group or layer is made up of those people who are referred to by scholars as the Orthodox Church Fathers. These people not only did not know the Messiah figure of the NT, they only knew of people who knew of the people who knew the people that knew him. That's how far removed they were from him. This group was 3 degrees of separation from the foundation granite layer. The doctrine and message of the first layer is all but gone and lost in these accounts, as most from this group are just citing those of the early church fathers that they liked, who only knew the apostolic fathers that came before them. Most of the doctrine of this group is far from anything solid, and many of them have actually labeled the earlier understandings from the previous layers as heretical, because they directly conflicted with their theologies of that day. It is in this layer that is responsible for the form of the New Testament presented today as canon. This is definitely a lot of metaphysical and metaphorical stuff just for some sources. But what's worse is there are about 400 more years of these layers. The ones that go up from here are not even worth talking about, mostly because they have no importance to this study, but also because they get pretty far removed from reality the further you get away from that granite layer. A quick disclaimer. It is not our claim that HaMashiach, or the Messiah of the 1st century Palestine, was not a real individual or that he did not exist. We're actually making the opposite case. We will use historical information in conjunction with scripture to prove that there was definitely a historical person that some people of the region recognized as their Messiah, called Yahusha, or Salvation of Yah. And there was a mythicized one later created by the Roman Church, eventually called Christus, or Christ, that everybody calls Jesus today. A chief propagator of this theology that became the core element of this Christus, or Christ figure, was Paul of Tarsus, whose early letters are mainly responsible for Pauline Christianity, which just about every person that accepts his writings as scripture and a part of their faith belongs to today. This definitely includes many of us, myself formerly included, who believe we are now in the truth, or those of us who believe that we have awakened to our identity and we are free from the bonds of religion. So enough with all this talking, time to get it in. Paul of Tarsus, who was formerly Shaul HaTarsi, that lived from 5 CE to 65 CE, is the accepted author of the 13 out of the 27 books that make up the Catholic New Testament, or what we would just call the NT for this study. This was finally compiled sometime in that sand layer during the 4th century CE by the Orthodox Roman Catholic Church. His books, which are actually letters, are understood to be taken from earlier copies. The earliest is understood to be Thessalonians and Galatians, which were supposedly written in 50 CE and 53 CE, respectively. We do know for certainty that Paul's letters, or at least some version of them, were going around in the 1st century CE due to Marcion of Sinope. He was a concrete layer source because he lived from 85 CE to 160 CE and was Gnostic in his views. He used the letters of Paul in his own version of the New Testament and spread it publicly, which caused the Roman Church to start assembling their own version in response. The Roman Church used this like a bag of Skittles and chose the colors they liked to make their own bag. Marcion was labeled a heretic by the Roman Church, and his writings only survive through other historical sources, such as a sand strata source, the Catholic Church father Epiphanius of Salamis, who lived from about 320 CE to 403 CE, in his Panarion, which means medicine chest, or his cures against heresies, because the Roman Church saw all this stuff as heretical back then in the 4th century CE. 2,000 years ago, there was no defined version of faith of people we now call Christianity. Catholicism, or Catholic, literally means universal in Latin. There were several forms of the faith system for people who accepted HaMashiach, or the Messiah, prior to the Orthodox Catholic Church. Gnosticism was just one of them, and we will cover it more in part 3 of this series on the NT. No one could honestly say whether the letters attributed to Paul of Tarsus are actually his writings or some corrupted version of them left to us due to the conflict between Marcion and the early Roman Church. No one could possibly say with any truth to that today. What we will attempt to do in this sections A, B, and C of this video is examine the historical accounts of Paul and others from the granite layer to compare them to some of the NT passages available to us today from the sandy layer. We will also take a close look at Acts and the letters of Paul as well to see what is the historical truth of the events, or get as close to solid ground as we can. There are no original existing copies of Paul's letters, and the earliest reasonable complete version available to scholars today is Papyrus, or P46, dating to about 200 CE, which is 150 years after the events described in the NT happened. This is P46. Primary source. It still exists today. We are not even close to being on shaky ground here with the existing concrete material, and the fact that it dates to 150 years after everything went down isn't so bad, especially when the oldest complete version of the Torah Tanakh, or OT, is a Greek version from the 2nd century BCE, or before the Common Era, thus making it over 2,000 years after everything in it went down. If you wanted to go to an Hebraic or Hebrew version of the text, it's even worse, because now you would have to rely on the Leningrad Codex, which is from about 1009 CE, and therefore over 3,000 years after the events depicted within the text happened. We will be moving forward with the understanding that information from the time period between Malachi, or Malachi, written sometime in the 5th century BCE, all the way back here, and the expulsion of the nation of Yasra'al, or Israel, from the land of Palestine in the 2nd century CE. We're looking at it as viable information. That's 600 years of history. If any of this seems off or an error to you, please watch part 1 of the series on the New Testament because we do not have time to cover any further in this study. A deeper examination and textual analysis of the books of the NT will be given within part 3 of this series. In part 2A of this series on the NT, we will show that Paul of Tarsus, who was probably associated with the Messianic movement initially, may not have been a Shulach or apostle, and that he was Edomi or Edomite. I already know that people are understandably shaking their heads at this video and saying that Paul is a Shulach, which is a brief for Hebrew or emissary, or what we would call an apostle today. Some people are probably even accusing me of blasphemy, as if it is blasphemy even to question Paul or his letters, even though he never knew or was taught by Hamashiach, and he joined a group after his death. Paul wasn't even technically a Shulach or apostle if we accept the definition given in Acts of an apostle. As stated, the primary source is our granted lair and is someone who has witnessed an event in question or was involved in it, making them the original source of information about the event. Sefer Ma'asim, or Book of Acts chapter 1, is such a primary source. Verse 21 reads, "Therefore it is necessary of the men which have companied with us all the time that the Master Yahusha went in and out among us, beginning from the immersion of Yachanan to that same day that he was taken up from us, must one be ordained to be a witness with us of his resurrection." To fill the role of a Shulach or apostle, one had to be taught by Yahusha from the start at the immersion of Yachanan until the day of his execution. That is what made you a witness to the resurrection and then filling the requirement of an emissary or apostle according to the text. A lot of people witnessed him alive again, but only those who were taught personally by him were legit Shulachim or apostles. Paul was a self-claimed Shulach, and it had nothing to do with anyone who lived, certainly not the 12, and not even the living Mashiach. Paul's apostleship was given by Ruach HaKadosh, or the set-apart spirit that he claimed was given messages from Hamashiach directly to him. Our primary source is Paul himself, Galatians 1:1. Paul, a Shulach, not of men, neither by man, but by Yahusha Mashiach, and Elohim the Father, who raised him from the dead. Romans 1:1. Paul, a servant of Yahusha Mashiach, called to be a Shulach, separated to the Busarah of Elohim. So this ordainment by Hamashiach, or his calling, was not something that occurred during the life of Yahusha. Paul never met the man. So this is a spiritual appointment that disregards the definition the 12 are using for a Shulach in Acts. Paul only even visited Yerushalayim 3 times in the nearly 70 years of history in the NT account, which we will detail, and his whole ministry was overseas. So please, let us refrain from any condemnations and just hear the matter out. Even after all that, I know that people are right now questioning my ability to read because Paul clearly says that he was a Yashar or an Israelite from the tribe of Benjamin or Benjamin. And yes, he stated that all of his instructions came from his visions or vision of Hamashiach, or his communications with him, as it is clearly written in the NT. I will only refute those thoughts with this simple reasoning at this time. What if the sand layer of history that those NT verses stating all those things came from were lies? Lies given to you by the Roman Catholic Church. What if Paul lied even before that? Then what? Were the men of the 1st century CE incapable of lying? Was Paul? In the Catholic gospel accounts, Kepha or Peter lies about even knowing Hamashiach. He does it to save himself from the Sadducee-controlled high priesthood. And Paul is depicted as a flat-out murderer of a righteous man. So I think it's safe to say that men did transgress during that period and thus could have lied. We're going to go over all of that and more over in this part. But in this section, We're going to make everything much more clear with a little granite and concrete historical perspective under our feet. One of these sources will be HaSefer Maccabeim, or the Book of Maccabees, which are scrolls that provide granite-level first-hand historical information of Yashar'al from 175 BCE until 134 BCE. It is the account of the leaders of the Yehudi, or the southern kingdom of Judah's rebellion against the Seleucid dynasty after their conflicts with the Ptolemaic dynasty, who both took turns in controlling the region we know as Palestine today until the time of the Romans in the 60s BCE. Sepharim Maccabeim, or the books of the Maccabees, are writings that are part of the oldest and complete copies of the OT, the Septuagint, which, as stated, is the oldest complete version of the Torah Tanakh. The Maccabeim, which means the hammers in Abrit or Hebrew, are also referred to as the Hasmoneans. This is probably not a family name, but rather a general designation of the sons of Aharun or Aaron that practiced extreme nationalism and refused to bow down to the foreign Greek oppressors. They were the legitimate family of priests, or Kohanim, that assumed control and made themselves kings after the Seleucid Empire was repelled, which wasn't remotely Torah in practice. They were ultimately forced out of power by the Herodians, who, as stated, were Idumi or Edomites. Another of these sources are writings from the 1st century CE by Yusuf ben Mattatyahu, who is now known today as Flavius Josephus. He lived during the 1st century from 37 to 100 CE in Palestine and was probably executed by Emperor Domitian based on historical accounts. He is the primary source of most scholars for that period of history and is widely accepted as a secondary source for historical information about Yashar'al and antiquity in general. His work Wars was composed when he was in his 30s, sometime in the 70 CE. It reflected the sectarian violence that led to the destruction of the Herodian temple by Titus, which was the refurbished Second Temple. His later work Antiquities was composed when he was in his 50s, sometime in the 90 CE, and is a historical account of Yashar'al from their creation account up to the destruction of the Second Temple, with more freedom as the sectarian violence quieted down for a bit. But honestly, this probably got him killed anyway for running his mouth. Josephus utilized the literature available to him at the time, and he practiced all the sects of the Yehudim as well as joined the royal family of the Romans, the Flavians. He was Yashar'al by his mother's side, but his father was a Herodian Pharisee, which is a typical Jewish standard for genealogy today, and one that began with the Herodians, who were Idumi, which is Abrit or Hebrew for Edomites. The Edomites are the nation that descended from the scriptural patriarch Esau or Esau, the twin brother of Yaakov or Jacob. Yaakov became the father of the 12 tribes known as Yashar'al or Israel today, and Esau became the patriarch to the Idumi or the Edomites. Therefore, the Idumi or Edomites are Abrim or Hebrews from the stock of Abraham. One lineage is Abrim Yashar'al or Hebrews of Israel. The other is Abrim Idumi or Hebrews of Idumea. The kingdom of Yehuda or Judea was ruled by the Herodian dynasty from the middle of the 1st century BCE to the end of the 1st century CE, or from about 40 BCE with the first Herod, Herod I, to the last king in about 92 CE with Herod Agrippa II. Agrippa II, although was king in title and had power over the temple, was not technically king of Jerusalem or Jerusalem. So many consider his father Agrippa I as the last Herodian king of Yehuda or Roman Judea. The Herodians were placed in power by the Romans and ruled over the region of Yehuda, Galil, and Shumaron, or Judea, Galilee, and Samaria respectively. They were basically the tax collectors or functioned as tax farmers for the Roman Empire. Historically, this is Herod I, who lived from 73 BCE to 4 BCE. He was put in rule by the Romans in 40 CE. He was an Idumi, as was his family and countrymen, but his mother was a Nabatean or an Arab, who they made alliances with. The Herodians were placed in control of Palestine by Rome in the 1st century BCE, and they polluted the priesthood. The priesthood became an aristocracy with the high priest ruling over the nation of Yashar'al and were simply known as Sadducees, Pharisees, and Herodians. Herod I is referred to some as Herod the Great. We don't call him that because he was a baby killer many times over. He was the forefather of the Herodians, and he was an Idumean by nationality, which is Greek for Idumea, which, as we already mentioned, is a Brit or Hebrew for an Edomite. Paul was one of these Idumea or Idumeans, just as all the Sadducees and some of the Pharisees were during his time, which included all the upper priests in the first century Palestine. That statement may be something that is different than what you may believe or may not believe, thinking that there's no way the wicked Edomites will be allowed in the temple or have anything to do with the things of the Most High Yah, and that there's no way that the Most High Yah would allow that. That's not all we're claiming, though. Most of the wealthy and aristocrats that made up the vast majority of the people who lived in the city of Jerusalem were Idumea or Idumeans too, during the first century anyway. The city was full of them. Let us look at our sources and see how this happened. The Idumean Herodians were converted to be Yehudi by Yochanan Hyrcanus or John Hyrcanus I, who lived from 164 BCE to 104 BCE and was of the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. Hyrcanus I was made Kohen Hagadol, or the high priest, following his uncle Jonathan being made Kohen Hagadol by Alexander, the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus the Mad, which was the same one who put the swine on the altar during the war with the Maccabees. Before we get ahead of ourselves, we will first establish that the Hasmoneans or Maccabees were actually of the priesthood from some granite layer first-hand accounts, because it had to be from the line of Aharon or Aaron to be a priest, much less a high priest. Maccabees Aleph, or 1 Maccabees 2:1. In those days, Mattityahu, son of Yochanan, son of Shamma'un, a Kohen of the family of Yorib, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. Historically, Mattityahu HaKohen ben Yochanan died in 165 BCE and is the progenitor to the Maccabees or Hasmoneans. They trace their lineage back to Yorib, which is the first course of the Kohanim or priests of the Second Temple in Scripture. Debri Hayamim Aleph, 1 Chronicles 24. The scribes, Shemaiah, son of Nethanel, a Lewi or Levite, recorded their names in the presence of the king and of the officials. Zadok HaKohen, or Zadok the priest, Ahimelech, the son of Abithar, and the heads of the families of the Kohanim, which are the priests, and of the Lewi, one family being taken from Eliezer and then the other from Ithamar. The first lot fell to Yorib, the second to Yediah. This Yorib is the descendant or the ancestry of the Maccabees. These are secondary sources that support that information. The secondary source either repeated the information in question or documented an event or information, but did not witness it firsthand or author it. Josephus is a concrete layer source for the information and is at most only 1 degree of separation from the foundational granite source. So we go to his Antiquities 12:6:1, line 265. Now at this time, there was one whose name was Mattityahu, who dwelt at Modin, the son of Yochanan, the son of Shamma'un, the son of Asmoneus, a priest of the order of Yorib, and a citizen of Jerusalem. This is a secular document as well. Next, we will calibrate the time periods of our primary and secondary sources. Our primary source, Maccabees Aleph, or 1 Maccabees, chapter 10, verse 1. In the 160th year of Alexander Epiphanes, the son of Antiochus, surnamed Epiphanes, landed at Ptolemais and captured it. The people welcomed him as their king. Our secondary source, Josephus, Antiquities, chapter 13, or book 13, chapter 2. Now, the 160th year, it fell out that Alexander, the son of Antiochus Epiphanes, came up to Syria and took Ptolemais and soldiers within having betrayed it to him, for they were at enmity with Demetrius on account of his insolence and many difficulties of access. So we see our granite layer foundational source of the writings of the Hasmoneans or Maccabees, which are the Maccabees, largely matches with the concrete secondary source of antiquities by Josephus. They both confirm that in the 160th year of the reign of the Greeks, Alexander took Ptolemais and was accepted as the ruler. Josephus just has a couple of extra details. This Alexander is known historically as Antiochus V, called Eupator, son of Antiochus the Mad, and lived from 172 to 161 BCE. This was the same Antiochus the Mad that slew the swine on the altar during the Maccabee revolt. After his father's defeat, Antiochus V had a brief friendship with the Hasmoneans. Maccabean Aleph, or 1 Maccabees chapter 10. King Alexander to his friend Yehonathan, greetings. This is a letter. I have heard that you are a brave man who has earned the right to be a friend of the king. I have this day appointed you as Kohen Gadol, which is high priest, of your nation, and conferred upon you the title of friend of the king. You are to be our ally and give us your support. He also sent him a royal robe and a gold crown. Yehonathan put on the robes of Kohen Hagadol, the high priest, in the 7th month of the 160th year at the Festival of Shelters, which just means Festival of Booths. He raised an army and stored up a large supply of weapons. Let's slide over to our secondary source, Antiquities. Book 13, chapter 4. When the wedding was over, Alexander wrote to Yehonathan, matches up fine, the high priest, and desired him to come to Ptolemais. So, when he came to these kings and had made them magnificent presents, he was honored by them both. Alexander compelled him also to put off his own garment and to take a purple garment, and made him sit with him in his throne, and commanded his captains that they should go with him into the middle of the city and proclaim that it was not permitted to anyone to speak against him or to give him any disturbance. Alexander, the son of Antiochus the Mad, made Yehonathan Kohen Hagadol, or the high priest, as well as the king of Yasharal. This is Yehonathan right here, from 160 to 142. We should all understand also that the priesthood was from the line of Aharon and Louis or Levi, and the kings are supposed to be from the line of Yehudah or Judah. Therefore, the Hasmoneans took or were given the mantle of kings outside of Torah. These Maccabees were nationalistic and zealous, and they were a group of Kohanim or priests that took their independence from foreign oppressors by force. This zealotry started with Tobi'Yahu, who they call Matthias at the beginning, their progenitor, then proceeded through his son Yehudah. This is one of the most famous one, or probably the most famous one, Yehudah Maccabee, or Judah the Hammer. This also went down to them, and this is where the name Maccabee got into them. So this is also where that whole moniker of the Hammers came from, when it really became the Hasmoneans. And so this traveled down to the entire family. And so it went to his brother, Yehonathan, as we just displayed, and he had the same zeal. Maccabean Aleph, 1 Maccabees, 1084. But Yehonathan set fire to the city of Ashdod and the temple of Dagon, burning to death all those who had taken refuge there. Then he set fire to the surrounding towns and looted them. A secondary source, Antiquities, Book 13, Chapter 4. Upon which Yehonathan pursued them as far as Ashdod, and slew a great many of them, and compelled the rest, in despair of escaping, to fly to the temple of Dagon, which was at Ashdod. But Yehonathan took the city on the first onset, and burnt it, and the villages about it. Nor did he abstain from the temple of Dagon itself, but burnt it also, and destroyed those that had fled to it. So basically, we see the same granite strata information is found one layer up in the concrete secondary source. Therefore, those who question the historical accuracy of Josephus as a source in respect to history are not basing that on a deficiency in historical or scriptural content, but more on a personal bias. Josephus was an admitted traitor and capitulated to Rome, no doubt, but it appears by the time of the late 1st century, during the 70 CE, when wars was composed, he may have witnessed the already shifting of truth through the next layer of history. Or he just got older and understood the situation more clearly. Either way, I believe this is evident in the preface to Wars. Josephus' Wars, Preface 1:1. Whereas the war which the Yehudi made with the Romans has been the greatest of all those, not only that have been in our times, but in a manner of those that have ever were heard of, both of those wherein cities have fought against cities, or nations against nations, while some men who were not concerned in the affairs themselves have gotten together vain and contradictory stories by hearsay, and have written them down after a sophistical manner. And while those that were there present have given false accounts of those things, and this either out of a humor of flattery to the Romans or of hatred towards a Yehudi. And while their writings contain sometimes accusations and sometimes euphonims, which means praises, but nowhere near the accurate truth of the facts, I have proposed to myself, for the sake of such as live under the government of the Romans, to translate those books into the Greek tongue, which I formerly composed in the language of our country, and sent to the upper barbarians. Joseph, the son of Matthias, by birth a Hebrew, he means Herodian, of course, a priest also, and one who at first fought against the Romans myself, and was forced to be present at what was done afterwards, am the author of this work. Josephus claims a Brit or Hebrew heritage, but not that he is Yahshua all of Israel. You notice that, right? And he also informs us that he is a priest, by which he means a Herodian upper priest or high priest. Continuing. Jonathan, or John Gotti as he is known today, eventually died through treachery, and then his brother Shamoun or Simon took over. After Shamoun dies, his son Yochanan, also called Hyrcanus, took over. Our primary source is Maccabees Aleph, or 1 Maccabees, chapter 16. Now, the rest of what Yochanan did from the time he succeeded his father, Shamoun, his wars, his deeds of courage, his rebuilding of walls, and his other accomplishments are all written in the chronicles of his reign as Kohen Gadol, which is high priest. Our secondary sources are Antiquities, book 13, chapter 7, verse 4. Now, he was the ruler of the Yehudi in all 8 years, but at a feast came to his end. It was caused by the treachery of his son-in-law Ptolemy, who caught also his wife and 2 of his sons and kept them in bonds. He also sent some to kill Yochanan, the 3rd son, whose name was Hyrcanus. But Hyrcanus, this is Hyrcanus 1, having taken the high priesthood that had been his father's before, and in the first place appeased Elohim by sacrifice, he then made an expedition against Ptolemy. The viewer may be wondering what any of this has to do with Paul of Tarsus or Edomite slipping in the priesthood. The answer, everything. Please, just bear with us a bit longer here. Those chronicles of the reign of Yochanan are lost to antiquity, and we don't have them available to us as granted first layer sources. We also see that Yochanan Hyrcanus, this is John Hyrcanus 1, right there, is ruling as Kohen HaGadol, or the high priest. And at this point in history, this means king as well, which is outside of what Torah dictates, but this is where the scroll of Maccabees Aleph, or 1 Maccabees, ends. In fact, there's no other history beyond this in any of the Sepharim of the Maccabees, or the books of the Maccabees. At this point, there's nothing more of a primary source for this time period of the Hasmoneans or Maccabees at all. But we have the continued information within the next layer of the historical strata, the concrete secondary source of Josephus, who as a Pharisee had access to all the foundational granite sources, such as the records of the chronicles of Yochanan Hyrcanus' reign, which were mentioned in the primary source. Now we can get to the point where the Idumi or Idumeans were made Yehudi. It was under this Kuhan Hagadol, Yochanan Hyrcanus, or John Hyrcanus I, that this happened. The secondary source, which is all that's available to us at this point in history, is still Josephus, Antiquities, Book 13, Chapter 9. Hyrcanus, who is just Hyrcanus I, took also Dora and Marissa, cities of Idumea, that's Idum or Edom, and subdued all the Idumeans, and permitted them to stay in that country if they would circumcise their genitals and make use of the laws of the Yehudi. And they were so desirous of living in the country of their forefathers, the Edomites, that they submitted to the use of circumcision and the rest of the Yehudi ways of living. At which time, therefore, this befell them, that they were hereafter no other than Yehudi. At this period in history, around the life of Yochanan Hyrcanus, who, as stated, was born in 164 BCE and reigned from 134 BCE until his death in 104 BCE, the Idumi or Edomites, Idumeans, whatever you want to call them, they became one nation with the Yehudi and were no longer seen as any different from the Yehudi. That means all the other nations who came in there all viewed Idumeans and Edomites as Yehudi, or the southern kingdom. This is well over a century before the time of Paul of Tarsus, who was born around 5 CE. We're well aware that people believe that Paul is obviously a Benjamite or a Benjamite based on his own words in verses like this. Romans 11:1. Ask then, did Elohim reject his own people? Certainly not. I myself am a Yashraali, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. We definitely will come back to this crucial point of this claim in part 2C. But for part 2A, we will continue with our study on the Idumi or Idumeans infiltrating the priesthood. Therefore, let us also not forget that Paul was also a Pharisee. Philippians 3:5. I was circumcised when I was a week old. I am Yashraali by birth, of the tribe of Benjamin, a pure-blooded Abrit. As far as keeping the Yehudi law is concerned, I was a Pharisee. You see, he made sure the reader understands that he was indeed a full-blooded Abrit, right? Sephar Ma'asim, or Book of Acts 23, verse 6. When Paul saw that some of the group were Sadducees and others were Pharisees, he called out in the council, which was the Sanhedrin, fellow Yashraali, I am a Pharisee, the son of Pharisees. I am on trial here because because of the hope I have that the dead will rise to life. Paul clearly states that he is a pure-blood Yashraali and gives his tribe as Benjamin, and that he is also a Pharisee, and most importantly, that he is the son of Pharisees. This is an important point, the reason of which will be clear shortly. Paul was also a Roman citizen. This man wore many hats. Sephar Ma'asim, or the Book of Acts, chapter 16, verse 37. But Paul said to the officers, we, he meant him and Silas, were not found guilty of any crime, yet they whipped us in public, and we are Roman citizens. Then they threw us in prison, and now they want us to send us away secretly? Not at all. The Roman officials themselves must come here and let us out. Paul's acting real bold with these Roman officers, isn't he? Paul goes off on them and then claims that he and the individual only named Silas here are both Roman citizens, and demands that the Roman officials personally come and tend to this situation. That is definitely bold in first century Palestine under Roman rule. Romans would torture people in front of their mamas for getting called out of pocket. That's just the truth of it. We also have a historical Silas that fits this time period in Josephus. Silas was a close friend to the historical Herod Agrippa I. This Silas helped Agrippa I when he was banished during the time of Tiberius Caesar. Agrippa I was from the last line of the Maccabee or Hasmonean princess Miriam I, wife of Herod I. He had Yashar blood through his grandmother. Historically, Agrippa I lived from 11 BCE to 44 CE and was born Marcus Julius Agrippa, named after the Roman statesman Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa. Herod I, who was his grandfather, sent him to live in Rome sometime in 5 BCE when he was very young. Herod did this right after he killed his own son and Agrippa I's father, Aristobulus IV. He eventually, Agrippa I meaning, returned to Palestine as an adult and came to power in the 40 CE after he helped assassinate Emperor Caligula and get his uncle banished. Primary source of this is Josephus, Antiquities. Josephus is now a primary source of this because he knew all these people and was alive during a lot of this. Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 6. A little before the death of Herod, 4 BCE, the king, Herod Agrippa, lived at Rome. He would have been 6 years old and was generally brought up and conversed with Drusus, the emperor, Tiberius' son, and contracted a friendship with Antonia, the wife of Drusus the Great, who had his mother Bernice in great esteem and was very desirous of advancing her son. Agrippa I grew up in Rome. This is a crucial fact about Paul because he grew up with Agrippa I, and we will cover that later in Part 2C. The Silas mentioned in the passage was Agrippa I's close friend who grew up with him in Rome too. He took care of Agrippa I when Tiberius had it out for him. Josephus is still our primary source. Antiquities 18:6. So his, meaning Agrippa I, friend Silas came into him, and two of his freedmen, Marsyas and Stechus, brought him such sorts of food as he was fond of, and indeed took great care of him. They also brought him garments under pretense of selling them, and when night came on, they laid them under him, and the soldiers assisted them, as Marco had given them order to do beforehand. And this was Agrippa's condition for 6 months' time, and in this case were his affairs. And Silas eventually became general of Agrippa I. Antiquities 19:7-1. Now Silas, same guy, same forever, all the way through, the general of the king's horse, it means his horse troop, because he had been faithful to him under all his misfortunes, and had never refused to be a partaker with him in any of his dangers, but had oftentimes undergone the most hazardous dangers for him, was full of assurance, and thought he may expect a sort of equality with the king, on account of the firmness of the friendship he had shown to him. We see that Silas was obviously a close friend of the Idumea or Idumean Herod Agrippa I, so close that he eventually thought he was equal to the king. This means he had to be a part of the Herodian dynasty, and makes perfect sense that he was a Roman citizen because he grew up in Rome. Josephus also notes that Silas is his friend. We see that Silas was obviously a close friend of the Idumea or Idumean Herod Agrippa I, so close that he eventually thought that he was equal to the king. This means that he had to be a part of the Herodian dynasty, and makes perfect sense that he was a Roman citizen because he grew up in Rome. Josephus also notes that this Silas, from the time of Tiberius, was his close friend too, which makes sense also because he was a fellow Herodian Pharisee as well. Please note the term of freedmen who were in subservience to Herod. This Roman citizenship of Paul is repeated later in the same book with even more information. Sefer Ma'asim, or Book of Acts, chapter 22. So the commander went to Paul and asked him, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" "Yes," answered Paul. The commander said, "I became one by paying a large amount of money." "But I've had this freedom since birth," Paul answered. The commander lets Paul know that he had to pay a lot of money for his citizenship, but Paul informed him that he had been a citizen since birth. Paul makes the commander understand that he is in a higher social status than he is. Verse 29. At once, the men who were going to question Paul drew back from him, and the commander was frightened when he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen, and he had put him in chains. So we see here a Roman centurion got shook because he realized that he had put hands on a Roman citizen, and all the other ones fell back too. Paul's citizenship, along with him being a Pharisee and the son of Pharisees, are crucial factors in not only proving his ties to the Herodians, but also how the Herodians slipped in the priesthood. But why? Wasn't everyone a Roman citizen under the Roman rule? Weren't many of the Yashraali Pharisees too? No, on both accounts. During that period, being a Roman citizen was like being in Islam in medieval times. This meant you were free from most taxes and other restrictions not afforded to non-citizens. There were 5 classes of people living under Roman rule in the 1st century CE Palestine: citizen, Roman woman, client state, slaves, freedmen. We will focus on only 2 for this study, the citizen and the client state, but we'll touch on the freedman in a sec. Cives Romani was a full Roman citizen. This individual could vote, marry, was free from public flogging, taxes, and rules or regulations given to the general populace and slaves. They could only be executed by the sword or beheaded and never tortured or impaled. This is exactly what Paul of Tarsus and the individual named Silas, who is probably the historical Silas in front of Agrippa I, were classified as. And this is apparent in Acts by the reaction and responses of the Roman soldiers. Paul couldn't be flogged or beaten publicly, and the centurions were afraid because they did it and they were guilty of breaking Roman law. The other class we'll be looking at is the client state, the Soci. Soci or Foederati were citizens of absorbed states within the Roman Empire that had various obligations to Rome through treaties made with them. The way that these individuals obtained legal rights as the state's client citizens under Roman law were by exchanging military service, in which Roman magistrates would tax the soldiers for Roman legions through said treaties. This is the classification that the Roman centurion fell under, and why he was curious how Paul became a citizen when he, as a centurion, had paid a huge price from his salary to be a citizen. I just want to point out, in case no one else noticed, Hamashiach nor the 12 were ever reckoned as Roman citizens, and Hamashiach was clearly tortured, and the others publicly beaten and tortured too. In fact, you can find no verse in any version of the NT that states any protection from abuse by Romans to the Yashraali anywhere except to Paul. And the Messianics, or followers of the Messiah, were publicly tortured and brutalized for centuries after all of this. It is safe to say that Yashraal, who were constantly battling Rome over the issue of taxes during that period, which we will get into farther in part 2b, they were not classified as Roman citizens and free from taxes. In fact, all freedmen, which is what the 2 who were under Agrippa I were only made Roman citizens in the 3rd century CE by an edict issued in 212 CE from the Roman Emperor Caracalla, which declared that all freedmen in the Roman Empire were to be given full Roman citizenship, and all free women in the empire were to be given the same rights as Roman women. This was well over 100 years after the death of Paul of Tarsus. So he was a Roman citizen for another reason than Rome just gave it to him as a freedman. Primary sources for this is the Edict of Caracalla and the Constitutio Antoniana, Municipium, and the secondary sources are Roman law and all these other scholarly sources on Roman history. The question now becomes, how did Paul receive his Roman citizenship if the rest of Yashraal did not attain it anything near that status? And what bearing does this have on him being a Pharisee from the line of Pharisees or even Idumean? It's quite simple. As stated before, it is because Paul, like many of the Pharisees and all the Sadducees and the other Herodians, were Idumi or Edomites, and that they were converted to being nothing more than Yehudi by Yochanan Hyrcanus or John Hyrcanus I. It is true that still doesn't explain how Paul got his citizenship, though. Let us take another look into the concrete layer, our secondary historical source, Josephus, for that information. Antiquities, Book 14, Chapter 1. But there was a certain friend of Hyrcanus, this is Hyrcanus II, an Idumi or Idumean, called Antipater, who was very rich, and in his nature an active and a seditious man, who was at enmity with Aristobulus, this is Aristobulus II, and had differences with him on account of his goodwill to Hyrcanus. It is true that Nicolatus of Damascus says that Antipater was of the stock of the principal Yehudi who came out of Babylon into Yahudah, that's Judea. But that assertion of his was to gratify Herod, who was his son, and who, by certain revolutions of fortune, came afterward to be king of the Yehudi, whose history we shall give to you in its proper place hereafter. Historically, this is John Hyrcanus II, who was officially the king of Yahudah for 1 year from 67 to 66 BCE, and then the ethnarch, which is just like the ethnic ruler of Judea, probably from 47 to 40 BCE. Antipater, the Idumean, who died in 43 BCE, was the founder of the Herodian dynasty and father of Herod I. He was the son to Antipas, who had first held that name. Antipater wanted control over Yahudah or Roman Judea by putting the weak Hyrcanus II back into the throne instead of his more nationalistic brother Aristobulus II. This resulted into an eventual civil war between the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. Josephus also informs us that people at that time were claiming these convert Idumi or Idumeans were from the same people of Yashraal that came out of Babylon, just as the Jews claim today and the Cuthians did to Yashraal during the Persian captivity, which we displayed in part 1 of this series. Antipater was extremely rich as well, which, as we will see, was common amongst the Herodians, including Paul. The Hasmonean or Maccabean dynasty ended in 37 BCE, a few years after the Idumean Herod I was declared king of Yashraal, with the title King of the Yehudi, from the Roman Senate. This was after Rome intervened in the civil war between Yochanan Hyrcanus II and his brother Aristobulus II, where Hyrcanus was forced to come to terms and surrender the crown but retain the high priesthood. Herod I backed the wrong horse and got ran out of Dodge during that war. So like the Herodians typically did, he ran right to the Romans for help. Josephus is only a secondary source for this information in his Wars 1:14-4. Hereupon, Antony, which is Mark Antony, was moved to compassion at the change that had been made in Herod's affairs. And this both upon calling to mind how hospitably he had been treated by Antipater, but more especially on account of Herod's own virtue. He just meant his capitulation of Rome. So he then resolved to get him made king of the Yehudi, whom he had himself formerly made tetrarch, or like governor. Mark Antony told them that it was for their advantage in the Parthian war that Herod should be king. So they all gave their votes for it. And when the Senate was separated, Antony and Caesar went out, with Herod between them, with the consul and the rest of the magistrates went before them, in order to offer sacrifices to the Roman deities and to lay decree in the capital. Antony also made the feast for Herod on the first day of his reign. The Romans loved Antipater and came to love Herod I too. The Parthians were a tribe of the Persians, and in the eyes of Rome, the Herodians were far better for the Roman occupation of Palestine than the Yehudi were. We are sifting through the sand and gravel left to us by the NT to get to the remaining nuggets of historical truth. And the reason Antipater was brought up in this study was not only to show how Edom or Edom became one with Yashraal during the Roman occupation, but also as to how Paul got that elusive citizenship. He got it by his Herodian bloodline as a gift from the most famous Roman in antiquity. Secondary source, Antiquities 14:8. So Mithridates sent an account of this battle to Caesar. This is Julius, same one who put Herod in the king, and openly declared that Antipater was the authority of this victory and of his own preservation, insomuch that Caesar commended Antipater then and made use of him all the rest of that war in the most hazardous undertakings. He happened also to be wounded in one of those engagements. However, when Caesar, after some time, had finished that war and was sailed away for Syria, he honored Antipater greatly and confirmed Hyrcanus in the high priesthood and bestowed on Antipater the privilege of a citizen of Rome and a freedom from taxes everywhere. Julius Caesar of Rome, who lived from 100 BCE to 45 BCE and was never actually emperor of Rome, confirmed Yochanan Hyrcanus II in the high priesthood, which was already an accepted outcome of the civil war by Yashraal, and he gave Antipater status as a Roman citizen that was free from all taxes. Please note that Caesar did not give the citizenship to Hyrcanus, who was actually Kuhan Hagadol, or the high priest, and Yashraali by blood. He didn't want that for the large population of Yashraal in the region. No, this is why Paul of Tarsus was recorded as a citizen since birth in the NT, an honor not given to anyone else of Yashraal or any freedman under Roman authority in Palestine. Only Antipater and the Herodian tribe from the Idumi or Idumeans received such a coveted status. They were royalty. Caesar merely confirmed the Yashraali Hyrcanus in the high priesthood, which was already his anyway. All Herodians were given status as Roman citizens from the patriarch of the Herodian dynasty, the father of Herod I, Antipater. Now, if anyone thinking that Paul was a wealthy free person and a Yashraali Pharisee, and that could be how he was given this Roman citizenship, nope. As we've shown, Antipater was very wealthy and a Herodian, and Paul's wealth and Pharisee background is just further proof that he was actually an Edomite. This same Herod, the son of Antipater the Idumean, removed the rightful scribes and upper priests, or Pharisees and Sadducees, which were originally the sons of Aharun, the Maccabees or the Hasmoneans. Only some of the Pharisees were still Yashraali by blood, and all the Sadducees were Idumeans, which were the Edomites. Josephus is our secondary source for this. This happened a little before his time. Antiquities 20. It's book 20, chapter 10. Herod I was then made king by the Romans, but did no longer appoint high priests out of the family of the Hasmoneans, but made certain men to be so that were of no eminent families, but barely those that were priests, excepting that he gave that dignity to Aristobulus, which is Aristobulus III. For when he had made this Aristobulus the grandson of that Hyrcanus, that was Hyrcanus I, who was taken by the Parthians, and had taken his sister Miriam, which is Miriam I, to wife, he thereby aimed to win the goodwill of the people, who had a kind of remembrance of Hyrcanus, which was his grandfather. Yet he died afterward, out of fear lest they should all bend their inclinations to Aristobulus, put him to death, and that by contriving how to have him suffocated as he was swimming at Jericho, as we have already related that matter. But after this man, meaning Aristobulus III, he never entrusted the priesthood to the posterity of the sons of the Maccabees. Archelaus also, Herod's son, did like his father in the appointment of the high priests, which is the Herodian establishment priests, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, as did the Romans also, who took the government over of the Yehudi into their hands afterwards. Accordingly, the number of the high priests from the days of Herod until the day when Titus took the temple and the city and burnt them were in all 28. The time also that belonged to them was 107 years. Some of these were the political governors of the people under the reign of Herod and under the reign of Archelaus his son, although after their death, the government became an aristocracy, and the high priests were entrusted with the dominion over the nation. And thus much may suffice to be said concerning our high priest. Herod I took the last Hasmonean or Maccabee princess, Miriam I, as his wife, and then after her 18-year-old little brother Aristobulus III put on the high priest's garments, he was jealous and then had him killed. The rest of them were pretty much scattered and murdered by Mark Antony after the civil war that happened. Herod also murdered Miriam and his two sons by her, Aristobulus IV and Alexander. The year before he died is when he sent his grandson Agrippa I to Rome, after or a few years after he had killed Aristobulus IV. The Pharisees and Sadducees were originally Yashraali, but all that changed after the Civil War. Herod I was put in charge with the help of the Herodian-friendly Pharisees that supported Hyrcanus II and admired Antipater. But the Sadducees, following Aristobulus II, did not capitulate. The original Sadducees were Sadducee or Zadokites, of the line of the ancient priesthood, as were the original Pharisees, until later when they were displaced and murdered by Mark Antony, as I just mentioned. The Herodian Pharisees and Sadducees were the main opponents for Yahushua HaMashiach and his sect of Nazarenes or Nazarenes and those associated with them. This opposition was led by Caiaphas and Canaan or Ananias, who were Sadducees and upper or high priests. These individuals were the ones primarily responsible for the execution of HaMashiach, probably around 37 to 38 CE. Basarah, Lucas or the Gospel of Luke, Canaan or Ananias, and Caiaphas being the high priests, the word of Elohim came to Yachanan, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. Basarah Yachanan, 18, and led him away to Canaan. This is Ananias or Ananias. First, for he was the father-in-law to Caiaphas, which was the high priest that same year. Now Caiaphas was he which gave counsel to the Yehudi that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. We see that not only were Caiaphas and Canaan high priests or chief priests, they were family through marriage. They also belonged to the sect of Yehudi called the Sadducees, that was by that time Herodian controlled and occupied. Primary source for them being Sadducees and related is Sefer Ma'asim, or the book of Acts, chapter 4, 6. And Canaan, Kuhan Hagadol, or Ananias the high priest, and Caiaphas, and Yachanan, and Alexander, and as many as were of the family of the high priest, were gathered together at Yerushalayim. Sefer Ma'asim, or book of Acts, 5:17. Then Kuhan Hagadol rose up, and they all that were there with him, which is of the sect of the Sadducees, and were filled with indignation. They were Roman appointed high priests. They were Sadducees, and they were all related. Josephus gives great detail into these matters. He is a primary source for this because he was alive during this period. Antiquities 18:2. This man, meaning Gratus, deprived Canaan of the high priesthood and appointed Yishmael, the son of Phabi, to be high priest. He also deprived him in a little time and ordained Eleazar, the son of Canaan, who had been a high priest before, to be high priest, which office, when he held for a year, Gratus deprived him of it and gave the high priesthood to Shamaun, the son of Cadmus. And when he had possessed that dignity no longer than a year, Yusuf Caiaphas was made his successor. When Gratus had done all those things, he went back to Rome after he had tarried in Yahudah, or Judea, 11 years, when Pontius Pilate came as his successor. This is why the issues in Yerushalayim, or Jerusalem, kicked off the way they did. The Herodian Pharisees and Sadducees were losing control, and Rome had to start intervening. Canaan, or Ananias, officially served as high priest for 10 years, from 6 BCE to 15 CE, when he was deposed at the age of 36 by Valerius Gratus, the Roman prefect of Iudea, or Judean province, from 15 to 26 CE under Tiberius Caesar. His son-in-law, Caiaphas, served as Kohen HaGadol from 18 CE until 36 CE, after 3 others, one of which was his sons, were put in place by Gratus. So the Romans are deciding who is the high priest here. And they're picking from the families that they already know are blood tied to the Romans and are not as nationalistic as Yashraal. Canaan was then put back in place from 36 to 37 CE, right after Caiaphas was removed in 36 CE. This is why Acts has him listed as Kohen HaGadol, or the high priest, after the execution of HaMashiach, even though Caiaphas was made Kohen HaGadol after he was. Canaan, or Ananias, was replaced by Theophilus ben Ananias, his other son, who was another establishment Herodian Sadducee high priest from 37 CE to 41 CE. This Theophilus is the same person to whom the author of Luke and Acts are addressing in their writings. Our primary sources are Sefer Ma'asim, or the book of Acts, chapter 1, verse 1. The former treatise I have made, O Theophilus, of all that Yahusha began both to do and to teach. Basarah Lucas, or the Gospel of Luke 1:3, is the other primary source. It seemed good to me also, having had perfect understanding of all things from the very first, to write to you in order, most excellent Theophilus. Prayerfully, things are starting to make sense to the viewer, and you can see what's actually going on here. Canaan was put back into office yet again in 44 CE after Theophilus was removed. Even though he had been officially removed from office, Canaan remained as one of the Herodians' most influential political and social figures, mostly because of the use of his 5 sons and his son-in-law Caiaphas, that were basically puppet high priests, and the Pharisees and Sadducees both were connected and related to them directly. This was a sacerdotal family. Under his reign as Kohen HaGadol, Yochanan and Mercer, or John the Baptist, was beheaded, Yahusha HaMashiach was killed, and Paul first joined the sect of the Nazarenes. He is a pivotal character in history. We have already shown that in Lucas 3:3, the text states that the high priests, which included Caiaphas and Canaan, were the ones who approached Yochanan and Mercer, or John the Baptist, in the wilderness. However, in another primary account, the group is just identified as the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Basarah Mattatyahu 3:7. But when he saw many of the Pharisees and Sadducees come to his immersion, he said to them, O generation of vipers, who has warned you to flee from the wrath to come? So this is the same group, just different designation. These are the vipers, or brood of vipers, which were the venomous priesthood mentioned in the Qumran corpus, or the Dead Sea Scrolls. Pharisees and Sadducees, chief priests and Pharisees, or scribe and Pharisees, are all interchangeable designations of the same groups, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, which were Herodian. The Pharisees were closer to the common man and still had members who were of Yashraal or Israel descent. This is the group that the Herodians used to marry into the lower priests to legitimize their rule as Idumi or Edomites of Yashraal, when they were sworn enemies in the Torah Tanakh. These upper priests were the Sadducees and Pharisees, while the lower priests were typically from the prominent families who were of the priestly order that the Herodians could use and marry into, such as the case of Yochanan and Mercer, or John the Baptist and his family. Basarah Lucas, or the Gospel of Luke 1. There was in the days of Herod, it is Herod I, who lived from 37 BCE to 4 BCE, the king of Yahudah, or Judea, a certain priest named Zechariah, of the course of Abia, and his wife was of the daughters of Aharun, and her name was Elisheba. According to the custom of the priest's office, his lot was to burn incense when he went into the temple of Yahweh. The lower priests handled temple duties that were not a part of teaching, such as like cleaning and dancing, singing, lighting incenses, etc. Abia, mentioned there, is of the lineage of the Kohanim that Zechariah descended from. This was from the priesthood that was ordered after the second temple was constructed. The mother of Yochanan and Mercer was also from the line of Aharon as listed in the verse. Primary source for the priestly courses is Sefer Nehemiah, or the book of Nehemiah, chapter 12. Now these are the Kohanim and the Lui, or the Levites, that went up with Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, and Yahusha, Sariah, Yarmiyahu, Ezra. The text beginning to list these Kohanim. Then it goes into verse 4, Edo, Genito, Abia. This is the priestly line that Zechariah held from. Yochanan is also another historical marker for the existence of Yahusha, because Yochanan and Mercer was his first cousin by his mother's side, who was 9 months older according to the gospel narrative. Primary source is Sefer Lucas, the book of Luke. And behold, your cousin Elisheba. She is also conceived a son in her old age, and this is the 6th month with her, who was called barren. And Miriam abode with her about 3 months, and returned to her own house. Now Elisheba's full time came, that she should be delivered, and she brought forth a son. The son mentioned there was Yochanan and Mercer, who was the first cousin and leader of the Nazarenes. This sect hated wealth, fornication, and pollution of the temple. These are all things that the Herodians were definitely guilty of. So as we have shown, Herod I died in 4 BCE. And from this time until the temple was destroyed was over 100 years of 28 high priests who not only weren't from the line of Siddiq or the Zadokites, but were not even from the line of Aharun or actual priests. Since Paul was born long after Herod I killed his wife Miriam, who was the last Hasmonean princess, and her little brother was the last legitimate Kohan Hagadol, he was born under and belonged to an order of Pharisees that were not Yisrael nationally, but Idumean. These Herodians, which included Paul, slipped into the priesthood and have stolen the inheritance of Yisrael. This is recounted in the epistle of Yahudah or Jude, who was one of the 12 Shuliach and brother to Yahusha HaMashiach. Primary source is Sefer Yahudah, or the book of Jude. It's only 1 chapter. Beloved ones, when I gave all diligence to write to you of the common salvation, it was necessary for me to write to you, urging you that you should earnestly contend for the faith that was once delivered to the Kodashim. For there are certain men have crept in unexpectedly, whose judgment was written of old. To this condemnation, wicked men turn the favor of our Elohim into indecency, denying the only Master Yahweh and our Master Yahusha Mashiach. Yehuda is telling those who were delivered the faith, which is Yisrael or Israel, to fight hard for it, because wicked men who were condemned by law long ago had slipped in. These wicked men are the Idumi or the Edomites. This is where rabbinical Judaism was derived. The Idumi made their own religion on the back of the faith of Yisrael. They slipped in and took over the faith, and their traditions of the elders is the Talmudic system still in place today. Primary sources are from the Jews themselves. 1925 Jewish Encyclopedia. Edom is modern Jewry. They are not of Israel or Judah. Jewish Almanac, 1980. Strictly speaking, it is incorrect to call an ancient Israelite a Jew or to call a contemporary Jew an Israelite or Hebrew. Encyclopedia Judaica. Edomite Jews began calling themselves Hebrews and Israelites in 1860. Paul being called a Yehudi in the text is not in question. What is in question is how the NT was designating people Yehudi. Everyone in there called Yehudi were not Yehudi by nationality, but some were these Edomi or Idumean converts. This is proven plain as day in Acts. You have to question the historicity of Acts in respects to Drusilla's racial designation. She lived from 38 CE and died in the Mount Vesuvius eruption with Pliny the Elder on 25 August 79 CE. She was a daughter of Herod Agrippa I and sister to Bernice, Miriam III, and Herod Agrippa II. These were all children from Miriam I, the wife of Herod I, and they all had their blood from the Maccabees from her. That's what these guys are. They're Herodians. Since Drusilla was daughter of Agrippa I and sibling to the other Herodians like Agrippa II and Bernice mentioned in Acts, she was definitely an Idumea or Idumean Edomite herself. In fact, her sister Bernice becomes the mistress of the same Titus, son of Vespasian, that destroyed the temple. Not only that, she and her brother Agrippa II were the ones who visited Paul while he was on house arrest in Acts. He was on house arrest at the Herodian palace. We'll examine that in part 2C, but we want to point out what Acts says about Drusilla's heritage. Primary source is Sefer Ma'asim, the book of Acts, chapter 24, verse 24. And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was a Yehudi, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Mashiach. Acts just straight up called Drusilla a Yehudi. Therefore, this is proof positive that the text makes no distinction between the Idumeans and Yashra'al, just as we have already shown since the days of Hyrcanus I. The passage even goes so far to say that the murdering Felix and the Herodian Drusilla were hearing the Nazarenes' Messianic doctrine. This is total garbage. They were hearing Paul's doctrine of the foreigner-friendly, laissez-faire, or do whatever you wanted Messianic worship. That sugary doctrine, that's what they was listening to. Even the statement that Drusilla was married to Felix is extremely telling. Marcus Antonius Felix was the Roman procurator of the Yehuda or Idumean province from 52 CE to 60 CE and was a Greek freedman from Emperor Claudius. So this dude still paid taxes, but Paul did not. I'm just saying. This is another example of the Idumeans marrying their daughters into other nations in order to assimilate with the nation that was in power. Many of these Herodian women would be 1/8 or less Yehudi, and genealogy was being determined by the mother, as is still the case in Jewish customs today. This was true for Josephus as well. His own source of his life, Josephus tells you plain out, by my mother I am of the royal blood, for the children of Hasmoneans, means the Hasmoneans, from whom that family of the Hasmoneans Maccabees was derived, had both the office of the high priesthood and the dignity of king for a long time together. I will accordingly set down my progenitors in order. Josephus hangs his claim of royal blood and priestly blood, which is not truly royal blood, to be honest with you, because they were priests that made themselves kings from his mother's Maccabee lineage. This is probably the same situation Paul of Tarsus is in. It is also probably why one of his closest companions was Yehudi, only on their mother's side. Primary source, Sefer Ma'asim, book of Acts, chapter 16, verse 1. Then he came to Debri and Lystra, and behold, a certain Talmud, or taught one, was there, named Timotheus, the son of a certain woman, which was a Yehudi and believed, but his father was a Greek. Paul loved this individual, identified only as Timothy. largely, in my humble opinion, because he saw himself and his situation in this man. 2 Timothy 1:5. To Timothy, my dearly beloved son, favor, mercy, and peace from Elohim the Father and Mashiach Yahushua our Master. Paul was a Pharisee, wealthy, traveling with Herodians, conversing with Herodians, and being saved by Herodians when in trouble. What else did he do that was like the Herodians when he got in trouble? He wrote to the Emperor Nero for help. Primary source, Sefer Ma'asim, Book of Acts 25. Then Paul said, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. I have done no wrong to the Yehudi, as you very well know. Paul's Roman citizenship was so powerful, it saved him from the Yehudi who were trying to kill him, who were the Sicarii zealots. He is awfully cool with Festus, so much so that he thinks Festus should know that he didn't do anything. Historically, Porcius Festus was procurator of Iudea or Roman Judea from 60 to 62 CE. Continuing, then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, meaning the Sanhedrin, answered, you have appealed to Caesar? To Caesar you shall go. It's just that simple. As a right, this is like a get out of jail free card. This is a Roman privilege, Roman citizenship card, straight up. Get out of jail free. You appeal to Caesar, off you go. And after certain days, King Agrippa, this is Agrippa II, and Bernice, which is his sister, came to Caesarea to salute Festus. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case to the king, saying, there is a certain man left in bonds by Felix. This is obviously a case of the Herodians coming to the rescue of their family member Paul. Paul used the Herodian special move of calling on Caesar. This wasn't just any Caesar, he called on Nero himself. But when I found out that he committed nothing worthy of death, and he himself had appealed to Augustus, I have determined to send him. This is another case of mislabeling, purposeful mislabeling. This isn't Augustus Caesar, who was Julius Caesar's nephew and the first ruling emperor of Rome from 27 BCE to 14 CE and then replaced by Tiberius. No, this is the emperor during the time of Festus. Historically, Nero was Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus that lived from 37 CE to 68 CE and was the last Roman emperor from the Julio-Claudian dynasty who reigned from 54 to 68 CE. He was a sadistic individual and is known largely as a person who persecuted the followers of HaMashiach. This was the Augustus Acts is talking about during the time of Festus that Paul cried to for help. People question how Paul could have been with this Nero if he's the one who killed him. Like, how could Paul possibly be in with Nero if Nero killed him, right? Nero killed his own mama and stopped out his pregnant wife to death in front of everyone. So that logic doesn't really hold up because he killed everybody. Can you imagine any of the other Nazarenes writing to Nero for help? This is a joke. It's laughable. Of course not. There was nobody in Palestine who had the power to write to Emperor Nero to be saved unless you were a Herodian. Like, they always go to the emperors for help. These Pharisees and Sadducees were nothing more than Greco-Roman Herodian mixed puppets for the Roman Empire. This is why there was so much unrest in Palestine during that period, because the true children of Yashra'al were contending for their birthright from the men who slipped in like Paul. In fact, of the 3 sects that existed in Palestine during the 1st century CE, only one of them were actually ethnically Yashra'ali, or Israelites. Primary source, Josephus, Wars, 282. For there are 3 philosophical sects among the Yehudi, the followers of the first of which are the Pharisees, of the second, the Sadducees, And the third sect, which pretends to a severer discipline, are the Essenes. These last are Yehudi by birth and seem to have a greater affection for one another than the other sects have. Of course they have a greater affection. They're actually related. The other people are just mixed people who are there for religion purposes. This obviously means that the Pharisees and Sadducees were not Yashraali by birth. As we've already shown, they were converts from the Idumi or Idumeans, who were the scriptural Edomites. The only sect of the three that were actually Yashraali by birth was that of these Essenes. These three sects are also reflected in his later work, Antiquities, as well. Antiquities 18, 1-2. The Yehudi had for a great while three sects of philosophy peculiar to themselves: the sect of the Essenes, and the sect of the Sadducees, and of the third sort of opinions was that of those called Pharisees, of which sects, although I have already spoken in the second book of the Yehudi War, yet I will a little touch upon them now. So, in his earlier writings from the 70s, Josephus records that there were three sects or camps of the Yehudi, of which only the Essenes were actually Yashraali or Israelites by nationality. And 20 years later, in the 90s, he still records just three sects in Antiquities. This also means that the Essenes were a core sect of the Second Temple Yehudi or Southern Kingdom of Judah. You should be wondering, why don't we hear of them today? And why aren't they recorded in any of the Gospels? They are. They're all over the NT. They are just the original granite layer authors of the writings and identify themselves by a different designation. Many people, myself included, have given camps a hard time, stating that there were no camps historically and that they are doing something new. But the historical truth is that there were definitely camps or sects during the time period, and the violence grew between them until the destruction of the temple. Yahushua HaMashiach was a part of one of these camps or sects as well. In the same way that the Pharisees and Sadducees, which were two examples of sects or camps, had multiple designations, this sect was no different. They were originally called Essenes, which is probably the Greek version of the Dead Sea Scroll term Osei HaTorah, which means doers of the Torah in the Hebrew or Hebrew, and is a key term in the Dead Sea Scrolls exegesis of Habakkuk or the Habakkuk Pesher, chapter 2. This is also a key element of the letter of Yaakov or the Epistle of James, 1:22-25 in the NT, where he insists you must be doers. These Osei became the Oseans and eventually the Essenes. Later they became known as the Nazarenes, or in the Greek Nazarenes, and finally as Ebionites. This is just the Hellenization or making Greek of names. Yehudi in Hebrew is Ayudean or later Judean in Greek. Maccabee in Hebrew is Maccabean in Greek. Idumi in Hebrew is Idumean in Greek. Nazarene in Hebrew is Nazarean in Greek. Shamaruni in Hebrew is Samarian in Greek or Samarian. So, being a part of any one of these sects or camps of Yashraal or Palestine in 1st century CE or BCE, and you weren't a part of these Essenes or nationalistic group that Yahushua HaMashiach, his family and friends all belong to, that we will be covering in the next part 2B of this video, if you weren't with that group or down with that clique, then you weren't Yashraali. And the people who came in there were just converts. They weren't people who were originally Yashraal. They changed. There are many examples of proselytes or converts. Paul was one for the Herodian dynasty. This concludes 2A, which was about the Idumeans becoming no different than any other southern kingdom Yehudi in the 1st century, and the Herodians slipping into the priesthood as well as Paul's similar traits and connections to that family. In part 2B, we will further the discussion by turning the focus on the NT's attempt to bury other key scriptural figures and groups such as these Nazarenes or Essenes, in the same way they did with the Herodians, with layers of overwrites and distortions. This also will go for his family, who were huge and integral parts of this camp. As always, we thank you for your time, and feel free to post a comment or disagreement, anything in the section of this video. Shalom.